Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to the programme which brings together British commentators, BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who write, broadcast and blog for audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, putting Israelis and Palestinians back from the brink of war, and decision day looms for Tokyo 2021. Does Japan want to host the pandemic games? Well, joining us this week, Geoffrey Kaufman, a Canadian broadcaster and former US news anchor who worked extensively in the Middle East as a correspondent, and the British journalist Jonathan Sacerdoti provides comment and analysis about Israel and its neighbours. Jonathan also campaigns against anti-Semitism. With me in the studio is Celia Hatton. Celia also hails from Canada. She's the BBC's Asia Pacific editor. Good to have you with us, and good to see both of you two there again, albeit remotely. Good to have you on Dateline. Now, the exchange of rocket fire, the fear and fatalities between Palestinians living in what much of the world calls the occupied territories and Israelis is familiar, even if it hasn't been seen on this scale for 7 years. What shocked even the most battle-hardened observers of this decades-old conflict is the way violence has erupted on the streets of Israel itself. It may be the Jewish state, but 1/5 of the Israeli population is Arab or Palestinian. Whilst the United Nations has warned of the risk of full-scale war between Israel's Defence Force and Hamas, the militant group which runs the Gaza Strip, Israel's president, among others, fears a civil war, pitting neighbour against neighbour. Jonathan Sacerdoti, how potentially dangerous is this moment, do you think?
I think we are seeing something quite unusual here in Israel, and unfortunately, both Israel and Gaza are used to these kinds of engagement that we're seeing going on in that part of the land. But when it comes to the internal fights between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, these are riots that we've not really seen anything like really for some time, if perhaps since the foundation of the modern state of Israel. So that is a challenge for Israel at the moment, especially while it's undergoing this barrage of rockets from Gaza at the same time. But we've got to remember, I think, that these aren't necessarily very symptomatic of the wider public. It's certainly a worrying sign that there are these divisions within the society in Israel. But these are really people representing the fringes on either side. And most Israelis, Jewish and Arab, do actually get on very well within Israel and coexist. Not to say there aren't problems like there are for ethnic minorities in all sorts of countries around the world. So I think it's a challenge, but it's definitely a secondary challenge to the rockets and the war going on down in the south.
Let's talk about that in a moment. Just to pick up on your theme, Geoffrey Kaufman, is there something generational going on here as well? Because in a sense that there seems to have been a kind of whether, a reluctant acceptance or just an acceptance of the status quo by the political leaderships on both sides in this conflict for quite a long time now. All right, we don't like it, but it is what it is, and we're kind of going to operate around it rather than worrying about resolving the basic problems. I wonder if perhaps younger generations are losing patience with that on both sides.
I don't know if it's generational. I think what it is this polarization of Israeli politics, much reflecting somewhat in a similar way that you see in the U.S., where you have this hard right that is intransigent, Prime Minister Netanyahu playing to that franchise, and so it really is. It builds on this. I don't know that I agree with Jonathan's perspective on this potential civil war. Let's not call it that. Let's be careful not to overstate it. But this internal clash is in many ways the crisis. The Israeli fight with Hamas is something we've seen before in 2014. This new dimension of internal strife, while it may not reflect, as Jonathan notes, the broader feelings and sentiments of Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis, the kind of horrific violence we're seeing of person against person within Israel has the ability to undo a lot that has been built over the last decades in trying to make Israel a multicultural state and to include Arab Israelis as in part of the democracy. Clearly not a complete project by any means, but this is a huge setback. And even Netanyahu, who likes to pit one side against the other, has recognized this, calling these outbursts against this violence against Jews and Arabs by the other side pogroms, which is a very, very laden word from Netanyahu.
Just, Jonathan, I want to pick up on that, because this question of, we can talk in a minute about the Palestinian political leadership, and there are all sorts of criticisms that can be labelled about President Abbas, cancelling the elections yet again, Hamas not obviously being a democratic organisation. But just in terms of Israel politics, quite interesting that the leader of the United Arab List, Mansour Abbas, who's been talked of as a possible coalition partner in a new government that doesn't include Benjamin Netanyahu, that he is one of those calling, for example, the protests by Arabs over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, for those protests to be halted, because he says he's worried that they will lead to something far more dangerous. In a sense, may this be a positive, potentially a positive moment for political leaders within Israel to recognise the risk and do something more creative to avert that danger?
I think there was that opportunity perhaps to come up with a creative solution with the fourth election results Israel just saw in quick succession. That's because of their slightly strange political system where you have to form a coalition government from really blocks of votes, either on the right or left. And for the first time, there was this Arab party, which could have been the kingmaker. It could have been the deal maker in holding together a coalition. And so that was quite uncomfortable for some, especially on the right, especially more Zionist-minded parties, especially as that particular party has Islamist tendencies as well. So I think it might be that the time for creative solutions in forming a government have now passed. And I think it might be a bit late to say that there could be dangerous results from those protests that have been encouraged by Hamas in Jerusalem, for example, on the Temple Mount and around Sheikh Jarrah, because, well, that's already happened. What's happened as a result of that is a spiral of events which saw Hamas then launch 6 rockets on Jerusalem, which is the holy city for Islam as well as it is for Jews and Christians. And then, of course, Israel had to respond to that, they said. And so there's all-out war really going on in the south, and people in Israel are undergoing a barrage of rockets, and people in Gaza are undergoing airstrikes from the Israeli military with quite some force. So I think perhaps the time for those creative solutions has passed, and perhaps the window of opportunity to include an Arab, slightly Islamist party in a coalition has also passed, because now I think what we've seen is the highlighting of divisions, and also the idea perhaps that some in Israeli society who started those protests and riots saw weakness in the debate and negotiations going on to make a government, and perhaps capitalized on that with this violence. Perhaps they saw that strong Zionist government that Benjamin Netanyahu was unable to form with his share of the votes maybe suggested that Israel was weakening and cracking. I don't think it's going to be very easy for that to be part of the government now.
Right. Jeffrey, before I bring Celia into, we kind of broaden out a little more of the global side, just a thought on what is happening in the south. There's lots of talk from lots of players within Israel, beyond the Middle East, indeed, a call from the White House too, from Joe Biden, for de-escalation. Is that realistic to use that language, given that this is a kind of fundamental, deep-seated problem that just keeps erupting?
So this is an interesting question, the role of Joe Biden in all this. Biden has for years, really since he was vice president under Obama, tried to pivot away from the Middle East. And really, as president, his focus, he wanted to focus on, and he has tried to focus on China, on Russia, on climate change, on toning the tension down with Iran. And he was really keen not to engage in Middle Eastern politics and Israeli Arab politics in the way that the U.S. has in the past. You don't always control events, even if you're the president of the United States. And in this case, Biden now is playing catch up. He's trying not to be the lead in this. He's trying to enable local actors, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, especially Egypt, to mediate this, as Egypt did in 2014. And he really doesn't want the U.S. to play the lead. But, you know, this is becoming much bigger than any individual. Whether Benjamin Netanyahu had a personal agenda to try to hold on to his job and to avoid being thrown out, whether Biden wanted to stay on the sidelines, this is now something very, very big and very, very worrisome. Can it go on? It's ultimately Israel is much stronger than Hamas. If this escalates, Israel has the firepower. But I think both sides recognize that. I think it's just hard to see how they're going to step back now that so many rockets have been exchanged, so many deaths have already occurred.
Celia, it's interesting. This is a long way away from the Asia-Pacific region, but it is one of those international issues that people, for example, governments like Japan, which has always sought to play a role of kind of a mediator role in international politics, they often find themselves involved in this. Is there much interest in what happens in the Middle East in your region?
There's a rising amount of interest. Let's look at the role of China. China's foreign minister played a visit to the Middle East earlier this year, and crucially, really tried to take the middle ground, visited Saudi Arabia, then went to Iran and signed a 25-year investment deal with Iran. So China's trying to start playing more of a role in the Middle East. They even offered to broker talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians later this year. However, as soon as the violence broke out in the past week, Beijing really called on the United States and said, Joe Biden isn't doing enough. They're ignoring the suffering of Muslims, particularly with the Palestinians, which is interesting, of course, because of
the treatment of the Uyghurs in China. Yeah.
Exactly. So really, when it comes down to it, I think the impulse in Beijing and frankly among a lot of countries in the region is to instantly look to Washington and wonder what's going on. And unfortunately, I think many people have been disappointed by the Biden administration's reaction. They're really falling into line with the idea that they simply haven't done enough. They haven't come out strongly enough to denounce the violence.
And Jonathan, is that part of the problem, the one that Celia alluded to there in terms of China, in that it's finding kind of honest brokers, people who are regarded within the region on all sides as not having a dog in this fight, to put it crudely, in a way that Washington can't be regarded because of its long history of involvement in the Middle East?
I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, which
this is the right place for it.
I assume that's why you invite me on the programme. This wouldn't have happened if Donald Trump was still president. And so I do think that Hamas, in making the calculation to launch those rockets and to really escalate the violence even before the launching of the rockets, they are responsible for trying to capitalize on the crumbling of the Palestinian elections before they even happened, when they were cancelled. They have been whipping up anger in among Palestinians in the West Bank to try and show themselves as the true protectors of Islam and Jerusalem there and the holy sites. I think all of this is partly because they saw an opportunity there, not just, of course, from the US side, but also they saw an opportunity with a weak Fatah, so weak that it cancelled those elections, having thought that Mahmoud Abbas might be able to renew his term. He's about 15 years into a 4-year term as president.
I think the Economist put it, it's actually 17 years, but I mean, it's number is almost immaterial, isn't it? The fact is he was supposed to have one 4-year term and stand for elections. That election never happened.
Well, that's right. And I think that, this gave Hamas perhaps the sense that now was the time to act. Now was the time to use these rockets that they've been stockpiling. Remember, of course, they have weapons, better weapons now, longer range weapons they had that came from Iran. Iran, of course, will have a hand in this as well. They will have had something to do with this, if not only the supply of those weapons and financing. All of this is really the perfect storm. And as you say, some of that is from the international scene, really. That America was perhaps not seen as being terribly interested at this stage under Joe Biden. And that's really one part of the jigsaw. Of course, the others are that Hamas wanted to try and prove itself to the Palestinian people and take part in this internal debate and struggle for representation of Palestinians. And I think that Israel is acting so firmly now in its reaction because it feels it has to show that that can't be allowed to happen. They keep saying that they're not going to accept a ceasefire at this stage because they haven't achieved their aims. So what are those aims, you might ask yourself? Well, those aims are to absolutely crush Hamas's capability because this last happened in 2014. We've had a relative quiet since then. Of course, there have been rockets here and there, but it's been sporadic. To have had 2,000 rockets, some of them actually not being caught by that Iron Dome defense system, only about 90% of them that can get caught by it. So there have been deaths. There's been a lot of destruction in Israel as well. That's something that Israel doesn't want to see happening. So it wants to send a very clear message to Hamas.
Jeffrey.
I think on the Biden question, while some are saying Biden's been asleep at the switch, this is a conscious, let's be clear, this is conscious policy by Biden. And Biden does not want the U.S. to have to go in and referee this perpetually. And his view is, let's pull back, let others come in and resolve this. We don't want, the only way to stop this kind of behavior is if we don't come in and use our muscle to make everyone behave, and then they go into their corner and then they come back and fight again. This is a calculation that may and may not work, and as it builds, it threatens not to work. But this is not, to be clear, Biden being asleep. He was probably a bit slow to react earlier this week, given how quickly things escalated. He's also under huge pressure within his own party. The left wing of his party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, are standing up for the Palestinians and saying, wait a minute, this is not about two equal parties throwing bombs at firing rockets at each other. This is about an imbalance of power and Israeli muscle. And yet, of course, he's got a very strong pro-Israel constituency and he himself has declared himself a pro-Israel guy in the past. So he's trying to balance a lot of as always, a lot of competing interests here. I think that we've now got to a point, though, for all of these people where this is becoming something very, very big and very, very scary.
Jeffrey, Jonathan, thank you very much on that. I'm going to come to Celia now for something that's happening in your region, Celia, because hosting the Olympic Games can transform a city's global reputation. Think London 2012 or indeed Tokyo 1964. Japan was hoping the return of the world's athletes in 2020 would have a similarly positive effect. COVID forced the International Olympic Committee to delay the Games by 1 year. Just 8 weeks before the Olympics are scheduled to begin, the head of the IOC can't even visit Japan because of the scale of coronavirus infection. Celia, we kind of have talked about this at different points on different programmes over the last few months. Will they, won't they, will they, won't they? We've heard again today from Sebastian Coe from World Athletics saying he's confident it's going to go ahead. He's been one of those who's been most kind of positive in the message he's been putting out. But the other noises off are very far from being that sure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's almost like two worlds are in play at the moment. It's fascinating, really. I mean, Tokyo won the Olympics back in 2013 with the slogan, "The Olympics will be safe in our hands." But frankly, the number of voices inside Japan that are mounting to say, actually, we don't think that that's true. We don't think that this is a safe thing to have. We're seeing now the Junior Doctors Union, other medical unions really voicing their disapproval. We're seeing top CEOs. One this week called it a suicide mission to carry out the Olympics. And frankly, when you look at how Tokyo, the government has been handling the COVID crisis, you can understand why people are so angry. For example, they've come out to admit that they haven't sped up their approval process for vaccinations. And so it's very, very difficult, really. They've only approved one vaccine so far. Only 1% of the population is fully vaccinated. They've also said, actually, we don't have enough people to staff vaccination centers. But at the same time, they're calling on nurses to go and work at Olympic venues. And so public anger is mounting. And really, the government just isn't doing a good job in convincing its own people that they really do care about dealing with the COVID crisis while mounting a fantastic Olympics.
The Olympics is turning into a bit of a cross for the Prime Minister to bear, isn't it? And it seems to be helping to drag down his not very high popularity ratings even when he started in the job, but it just seems to be one of those things that seems to be pushing him down and down almost every time he speaks on it.
Yeah, I mean, what's really sad is that the aim was to host the Olympics and really project this image of Japan as this nation full of vitality, full of energy, this really exciting country, and to really recast it in a way. And instead, it's the Prime Minister is struggling. His approval rating is at 35% at the moment, and the country is really struggling to recast itself as anything but a country that's really fumbling to deal with really intrinsic things like COVID measures and restrictions.
How big a deal would it be for Japan if the Olympics were cancelled altogether?
Well, it'd be a massive problem. I mean, this is the most expensive Olympics in history. It hasn't even kicked off yet, and they've already spent $15 billion. And so I think the political calculation is that they might as well go ahead and have the event and at least be able to recoup some of the good feeling that might come out of it once the flame is lit. Because if it doesn't go ahead, then you're going to be faced with a situation where Japanese taxpayers are paying for an event that never took place. That would be catastrophic for the ruling party. And I don't know if they'll ever really recover from it.
Jonathan, do you think it would be much of a Games even if it does go ahead, given that in many parts of the world, because of the effects of COVID, a lot of the kind of qualifying events haven't happened. A lot of the athletes who would normally have taken place haven't been able to take part in those because either they've had COVID or they've been isolated from one reason or another, or some have not wanted to be involved because they've been nervous about being involved in competitive events. Whether the whole kind of COVID effect just colours the whole event in a way that means it will never be seen as a conventional, traditional and therefore successful Olympics.
I don't think it can be. I mean, in 1894, Pierre de Coubertin proposed the Olympic motto, Citius, Altius, Fortius, faster, higher, stronger. But I don't think he was talking about disease infection rates. And I'm afraid that however important the Games are, for whatever reason, the wider health of mankind has to come first. The Olympic Games are supposed to spread a message of brotherhood and friendship between nations, and that's the kind of games you're talking about. And that uses sport as a common language to express that human drive to excellence. But I don't think anything could be less in keeping with that noble spirit than spreading a potentially deadly virus and allowing, new variants of it to spread around the world freely. And not least when Osaka has people who've died because they've run out of hospital beds. Less than 3% of the Japanese population's been inoculated. Nearly 60% of people in Japan don't even want the Games there anymore at all. One of the great legacies of the Olympics in every city it goes to is the promotion of sport and therefore improvement in health. Well, that won't be the case for this Olympics. It can't be seen as the Olympics of good health. Can't be seen as the Olympics of fair play. It just needs to be cancelled, I think.
Jeffrey, cancelling it would be a big deal, not just for Japan, not just for the International Olympic Committee, but actually for all those very big sponsors, the people who are involved in the broadcasting rights, all the rest of it. There's a lot of money that hangs on an Olympics now, isn't there? I mean, these are not insignificant business opportunities, Olympic Games, and more than just however important the sporting should be right at the centre of it, as Jonathan quite rightly says. But we can't ignore that.
No, we can't, and I think it's important to recognize that the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is driving this as much as the government, or more than the government of Japan, and the threats against the government of Japan if they cancel this are huge in monetary terms, and as we've already noted, they've already spent billions and billions on these games. The Olympics were in trouble before all of this. Yeah. We've seen in the last 10, 15 years, fewer and fewer cities offering to host the Games because they, far from being an opportunity to rebrand and project an image to the world, they come at huge cost. I covered the 2012 Olympics from beginning to end for ABC News here in London, and it was a thrill. It was a success. London pulled it off. It was about collegiality. It was about community. The athletes got to meet each other. People came. They felt good. London really managed to do this in a way that was extraordinary. But I think we'll look back and say, Rio struggled after that. They pulled it off, but with great political cost domestically. I think that this is a real turning point for the Olympics. There is a day of reckoning. It was going to come. It's too expensive to float around from city to city every 4 years. It's too big an ask. Something's going to have to give, whether it's a permanent or a rota of a few cities. Otherwise, we're not going to see democratic countries take this. It's going to be autocratic countries that can do this and declare and use dirty money to build sports facilities. It's just not viable to see this model go ahead. And it's sad because, look, these athletes have trained. There isn't those who can't go. They're not going to get another chance, many of them, as they grow older and life passes them by. It comes at huge cost. But I have to agree with Jonathan. This just completely undermines and discredits the notion of the Olympic ideals. And as much as we would like some degree of normalcy during this incredibly difficult period, the cost of it is so enormous that it really becomes impossible to justify on human terms, putting aside the monetary cost, which has to take a back seat.
It was interesting, Celia, Jeffrey, they're talking about the 2012 Olympics. I was in Singapore, which was the meeting where the bid cities came together and they had to lobby the IOC. It was a phenomenal event. We had President Chirac arriving from Paris. You had Tony Blair, of course, the queue down the stairs, people wanting to meet him because at the time he was the big kind of rock star of international politics. And arguably his lobbying helped tip the balance in London's favour. That's what people who were there of all political persuasions and none subsequently told me. But even for London in 2012, it was a big prize. There were lots of fears in the run-up to it about security, about the cost going out of control, about whether things would work and happen on time. In the end, they did. I mean, it's big risk, even if it goes ahead for Japan, because now on top of it, doing it with empty stadia, with all these restrictions on people, it's not going to be the fun event that perhaps many would have hoped it could be.
Well, listen, Sean, I've been talking to Olympic organisers. So I know we're being very, very down on the Olympics, but I will tell you what they have told me. And I think there is an element of truth to this, that for the global spectators watching at home, it might not look that different, actually. You know, you'll be able to see the athletes compete. They're quite, IOC organizers are very committed to that. For the athletes themselves, as Jeffrey said, who've been working for not just years, but decades in some instances up to this moment, you know, they'll be able to have that moment that they've been looking forward to. The Japanese organisers are emphatic that they will maintain this bubble. And we have seen in other countries that they have been able to pull off mass sporting events and to be able to maintain these bubbles. So I know that Japan wants to go for this moment where we can all feel as one and feel that kind of light at the end of the tunnel feeling. And maybe they'll do it. Maybe, you know, we're 10 weeks out. Maybe in 12 weeks' time, we'll be all thinking something quite different.
Well, if we are, we'll do it again on this programme, and we can all of us eat humble pie. But I'm just going to ask you one quick question before we go. In your fantasy, in your dreams, if you could be an Olympian in any sport, what would it be, Jonathan?
Oh gosh, put me on the spot. I think probably watching the news. That doesn't count, does it?
That's a cop-out, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I've seen you on a cycle, so it'd have to be cycling.
Yeah, I guess I'd want to be a marathon cyclist. You're right. I love cycling, but I have to say, the beauty of Olympic rowing has always captivated me. There's something about that really thrills.
Celia?
I'm Canadian. I have to say figure skating.
Of course you do. What an image we've left you all to conjure with. That's it for Dateline London for this week. My thanks to Celia Hatton, Jonathan Sacerdoti and Jeffrey Kaufman. Programme back same time next weekend. Goodbye.